For 30 years, the ships came in darkness. Container vessels flying European flags would dock at the ports of West Africa, their manifests stamped with official seals, their cargo holds filled with what the paperwork called development assistance, rubber goods for agriculture, and recycling materials for education. But the children who lived near the dumping sites knew better. They had watched their playgrounds turn black, their streams run thick with oil, their cattle refused to drink from wells that once ran clear. They had buried grandparents whose lungs filled with the smoke of burning tires, whose skin bore the rashes of chemical exposure, whose final words were whispered apologies for the poisoned earth they were leaving behind. The children knew that those ships carried death disguised as charity, waste wrapped in the language of partnership. But children's voices carry little weight in rooms where contracts are signed and briefcases change hands. Their truth was buried under layers of bureaucracy, diplomatic courtesy, and the desperate hunger of nations told they needed help from the very countries that were slowly killing them. This is the story of how that silence was finally broken, how a nation found its voice, how waste became wonder, and betrayal became the seed of an unprecedented transformation. The drone footage played across screens worldwide like a revelation from hell. An endless sea of black tires stretched to the horizon under the scorching West African sun, a landscape so apocalyptic it seemed like something from a climate fiction nightmare. Not a single tree broke the monotony of decay. No birds flew overhead. Just heat shimmers rising from rubber graveyards, the silence only broken by the buzz of flies and the distant sound of children coughing. The journalist, Mariam Ouedraogo from Radio Television Burkina Faso, had arrived at dawn with a small camera crew. She had received a tip from a whistleblower within the Ministry of Environment, someone who had finally grown tired of stamping approvals for death. The footage she captured would change everything. "Europe's garbage empire," read the headline on her report. "This is a foreign landfill, and it's in Burkina Faso." Her voice cracked with emotion as she walked through the wasteland, her feet crunching on fragments of rubber and glass. The smell was overwhelming, a toxic cocktail of burning plastic, chemical runoff and decay that made her eyes water behind her sunglasses. She pointed her camera at mountains of tires that reached 20 feet high, some still smoldering from fires that had burned for weeks. "For 15 years, she said, struggling to keep her composure, "this land has been the final destination for Europe's unwanted waste. Tires marked as agricultural equipment, electronics labeled as educational donations, chemical containers stamped as development assistance, all of it ending up here, poisoning the soil our children should inherit." She confronted a local customs officer guarding the dump's gates, a thin man in a faded uniform who seemed utterly unaffected by the devastation surrounding him. "Who approved this?" she demanded, her microphone thrust toward his face. He shrugged with practiced indifference. "They paid the fee. The paperwork was in order. What more do you want?" "I want to know how you sleep at night," she shot back. The officer's expression didn't change. "I sleep fine. It's not my land they're poisoning." That exchange, captured in crystal-clear audio, would be replayed millions of times over the coming weeks. The clip went viral within hours of being posted online, shared by environmental activists, human rights organizations, and ordinary citizens who could no longer pretend they didn't know where their trash ended up. In the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré was conducting a routine economic meeting with his ministers when his aide, a young woman named Fatimata, slipped quietly into the room. She carried a tablet, her face grave with the weight of what she needed to show him. "Excuse me, Mr. President," she whispered, approaching his chair. "You need to see this immediately." Traoré looked up from the budget document spread across the mahogany table. His ministers paused mid-sentence, sensing the gravity of the interruption. Fatimata placed the tablet in front of him and pressed play. For 7 minutes and 32 seconds, Traoré watched in complete silence. His face remained motionless, a mask of presidential composure, but those who knew him well could see the storm building behind his eyes. His knuckles whitened as his grip tightened on the armrest of his chair. His jaw muscles worked as he ground his teeth together. When the video ended, the room was tomb quiet. Even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to tick more softly, as if afraid to break the spell of rage and determination that had settled over the president like a shroud. "Shut it down," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of absolute authority. Nobody needed to ask what he meant. They had all seen the footage. They had all felt the shame of it settling into their bones like radiation. That night, while his security detail waited in armored vehicles, Traoré stood alone at the edge of the tire field that had become the symbol of his nation's humiliation. The moon was full, casting an eerie silver light over the black landscape. Under his boots, the ground was not earth, but a carpet of rubber fragments, broken glass, and medical waste that crunched with each step. He knelt and picked up a handful of the toxic soil, letting it run through his fingers like black sand. The smell was overwhelming, a cocktail of chemicals that burned his nostrils and made his eyes water. Somewhere in the distance, a child coughed in her sleep. "We were supposed to inherit a homeland," he muttered to the darkness. "Not a trash can." By morning, every television and radio station in Burkina Faso had received the same emergency directive: clear the schedule for a presidential address. No advance text was provided, no talking points distributed. The press secretary's only instruction was brutal in its simplicity: "The president will speak. The nation will listen." At 7 a.m. sharp, as families gathered around their radios for the morning news and market vendors set up their stalls, Ibrahim Traoré appeared on screens across the country. He stood behind a simple podium, no flags or ceremonial trappings, wearing a plain white shirt that seemed to glow against his dark skin. His eyes held a fire that even the television cameras couldn't diminish. "My fellow citizens," he began, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "For decades we have been silent while others dumped their guilt on our soil. We have smiled while they poisoned our children. We have said thank you while they buried our future under mountains of their waste." He paused, letting the words sink in like seeds planted in fertile ground. "That ends today, not tomorrow, not next week, today." The declaration that followed would reverberate across continents. Effective immediately, the Republic of Burkina Faso bans all imports of foreign waste, rubber, plastic, electronic, medical, or otherwise. All existing contracts are voided. All shipments will be turned away. All officials who facilitated this poisoning will be investigated and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. His voice rose with each sentence, the fire in his eyes now blazing openly. "Our land is not for sale. Our dignity is not recyclable. Our children's future is not negotiable. And to those who profited from our pain, to those who built mansions from our misery, to those who sleep peacefully while our babies cough blood, your time is over." The reaction from Europe was swift and predictable. Within hours of Traoré's address, newspapers across the continent were running editorials denouncing the move as populist, anti-business, and environmentally irresponsible. Television talking heads debated whether Burkina Faso had the economic leverage to sustain such a defiant stance. One French anchor, Marcel Dubois of France 24, delivered what became the most quoted response. "What will they do with all that garbage now? Ship it to the moon? The Africans have always been emotional rather than practical." But while European media outlets scrambled to frame the story as economic self-destruction, something else was happening on the ground in Burkina Faso. At border crossings and ports, trucks loaded with European waste were being stopped by soldiers who had received new orders. No exceptions, no negotiations, no bribes. At the port of Bobo Dioulasso, a massive container ship flying a French flag was turned away just hours after docking. The ship's captain, a weathered man named Philip Martel, stormed into the Port Authority office waving a thick stack of papers. "We have permits!" he shouted at the young customs officer behind the desk. "These contracts were signed by your government. They're legally binding." The officer, barely 25 years old, but carrying himself with newfound authority, looked up calmly. "Permits written by ghosts?" he asked, echoing the words his commander had taught him. "This is a new country now." While European officials scrambled to understand what had triggered such a dramatic shift, TRAORÉ was already 3 moves ahead. In the presidential palace, he sat with his intelligence chief, Colonel Dambiba, surrounded by boxes of classified files that told the real story of Burkina Faso's transformation into a continental dumping ground. The documents painted a picture of systematic betrayal, stretching back decades. Ministers had accepted briefcases full of euros in exchange for rubber-stamping waste import licenses. Port officials had been paid to look the other way while ships unloaded their toxic cargo. Environmental inspectors had been bought off with vacations to Paris and scholarships for their children to study in European universities. This wasn't neglect, TRAORÉ said, holding up a bank statement showing a $3 million transfer to a Luxembourg account belonging to the former Minister of Environment. This was betrayal, systematic, calculated, profitable betrayal. Colonel Dambiba shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mr. President, some of these officials are still serving in the current government. They have allies, connections." TRAORÉ cut him off with a look that could have melted steel. Not for long. The next morning brought another televised announcement, this one even more revolutionary than the first. "We will not hide this shame. We will not bury this truth. We will transform it." Engineers were summoned from universities. Architects were called from their studios. Farmers were invited from their fields. Schoolchildren were excused from classes. Artists put down their brushes and picked up shovels. A national challenge was born, broadcast live across the country. What can you build from what they threw away? In the village of Tanguine d'Assouri, 30 kilometers from the capital, a young widow named Amina Ouedraogo heard the president's challenge and felt something stir in her chest that had been dormant since her husband's death 3 years earlier. At 28, she had already buried a spouse, raised 2 children alone, and watched her small farm struggle with soil contaminated by runoff from nearby tire dumps. Amina was not a woman given to grand gestures or political speeches. She was 5 feet tall, with calloused hands, and a quiet manner that made people underestimate her strength. But when she heard TRAORÉ's words, something clicked into place in her mind like a puzzle piece finding its proper home. The next morning, while her neighbors were still discussing the president's announcement over breakfast, Amina was already walking toward the massive tire dump that had plagued their community for 15 years. She carried only a machete, a pair of worn gloves, and a determination that burned brighter than the sun rising over the poisoned landscape. The dump was a nightmare of epic proportions. Tires were stacked 20 feet high in some places, creating black mountains that blocked the view of the horizon. Between the stacks, pools of toxic water had collected, creating a breeding ground for mosquitoes and a rainbow sheen of oil that reflected the morning light like a sick parody of beauty. Amina stood at the edge of this wasteland for a long moment, breathing through her mouth to avoid the worst of the smell. Then she stepped forward and began pulling tires from the nearest pile, one by one, dragging them to the road where they could be loaded onto trucks for the new national collection program. Her hands bled within the first hour. The rubber was sharp in places, soft and chemical-soaked in others. But she kept working, muttering a prayer her grandmother had taught her. Allah, give me strength to carry what I cannot understand. By noon, curious neighbors had begun to gather. They stood at a safe distance at first, watching this small woman wage war against a mountain of waste with nothing but her bare hands and stubborn will. "Amina," called out Fatu, an older woman from the village council. "You'll kill yourself doing this alone." Amina paused, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her glove. "Then I'll die trying to save my children's future instead of living to watch it rot." Her 10-year-old daughter, Rosmane, appeared at her side carrying a water jug and a handful of rags. "If you're going to die," the girl said, with the matter-of-fact tone that only children can manage, "I'll die helping you." That broke something open in the gathered crowd. First one neighbor stepped forward, then another. By evening, 30 people were working to clear the dump, their voices rising in work songs that their grandparents had sung while planting millet and harvesting cotton. Mariam Ouedraogo, the same journalist who had filmed the original exposé, arrived in Tunghin Dasari 3 days later with her camera crew. She had received a tip about a remarkable cleanup effort led by a village woman, but nothing had prepared her for what she found. The dump was transformed. Where toxic mountains had stood just days before, neat rows of cleaned tires were now arranged like soldiers awaiting orders. Children ran between the rows, turning the space into a playground while their parents continued the work of sorting and cleaning. At the center of it all was Amina, now surrounded by a team of volunteers who looked to her for direction with the kind of respect usually reserved for elected officials or religious leaders. She was teaching a group of teenage boys how to cut tires safely, how to identify which ones could be repurposed and which needed to be sent for proper disposal. "This is what happens," Amina told Mariam's camera, gesturing toward the transformed landscape, "when people stop waiting for permission to save themselves." Mariam filmed Amina's daughter demonstrating how tires could be stacked and filled with soil to create raised garden beds. "We can grow onions in these," 10-year-old Rosmane explained with the confidence of someone who had personally tested the theory. "The rubber keeps the moisture in and the weeds out." That night, Mariam's report aired across the country. The headline read, "The Nation That Refused to Rot." But it was the image that captured hearts. A small girl kneeling beside a tire filled with green shoots, her hands black with soil, but her smile brighter than sunshine. President Traoré's investigation into the waste-dumping conspiracy began in the basement of the National Archives, a place that smelled of dust, mildew, and secrets left too long in the dark. The building itself was unremarkable, 3 stories of concrete and glass erected in the 1980s with French development aid. But its basement contained the paper trail of 30 years of environmental betrayal. Traoré descended the narrow stairs accompanied by 2 aides and the archives director, a nervous man named Professor Kabore, whose hands shook as he fumbled with the keys to the restricted sections. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting shifting shadows between rows of metal shelving that stretched from floor to ceiling. "Everything is catalogued," Professor Kabore explained, his voice echoing in the underground space. trade agreements, port clearances, environmental permits, ministerial correspondence. The sensitive documents are in the locked cabinets. TRAORÉ nodded grimly. Open them all. The first cabinet revealed a treasure trove of damning evidence. Folders labeled Rubber Goods Import Authorization contained documents that told a very different story than their innocent titles suggested. TRAORÉ pulled one file at random, a 2009 agreement stamped by the Office of the President and signed by Ousmane Ouedraogo, the former Minister of Environment. The document described an EU-Burkina partnership for agricultural development that would bring recycled rubber materials for farm equipment support and playground construction. But attached to the cheerful rhetoric was a wire transfer receipt for 1.2 million euros to a numbered account in Luxembourg, along with a shipping manifest that listed the actual cargo: 50,000 used tires, 200 oil drums, 15 tons of electronic waste, and 500 containers of miscellaneous chemical residue. Playground materials, TRAORÉ muttered, his voice dripping with disgust. The next file was even worse. A 2013 agreement described an EU Green Partnership Initiative with incentives for rubber recycling and environmental education. The rhetoric was beautiful. Pages of text about sustainable development, capacity building, and South-South cooperation. But the reality was brutal. Unprocessed tires soaked in industrial chemicals, oil drums leaking heavy metals, batteries corroded with acid, and containers of medical waste from European hospitals. Each document came with its own financial reward. Bank statements showed regular transfers to accounts in Monaco, Switzerland, and the Cayman Islands. Vacation receipts from ministers who had suddenly developed a taste for skiing in the Alps and shopping in Milan. School tuition payments for officials' children who had mysteriously gained admission to exclusive European boarding schools. TRAORÉ worked through the files for hours, his rage building with each revelation. This wasn't random corruption or bureaucratic incompetence. This was a systematic program to transform Burkina Faso into Europe's toxic waste dump, with local officials serving as willing accomplices in exchange for personal enrichment. That evening, under heavy security, former Environment Minister Ousmane Ouedraogo was escorted to the presidential palace. Once a powerful man who had commanded rooms with his presence and his connections to European capitals, he now walked slowly, head down, shoulders sagged under the weight of exposure. TRAORÉ waited in his office with no aides, no cameras, no witnesses, just the two of them and the truth that lay scattered across the presidential desk in the form of bank statements, contracts, and shipping manifests. TRAORÉ said without preamble, sliding the 2009 document across the polished wood. Ouedraogo barely glanced at the papers. His voice, once booming with authority, had shrunk to a whisper. "I was ordered to." By whom? The question hung in the air like smoke. The former minister hesitated, then leaned back in his chair with the defeated air of a man who had run out of places to hide. What difference does it make now? TRAORÉ's eyes narrowed. It makes all the difference in the world. Children are drinking poison. Cattle are dying. Families are burying their grandparents who died from cancer caused by chemicals your signature allowed into our country. You want me to tell them it was no one's fault? Ouedraogo's hands trembled as he wiped sweat from his forehead. It wasn't just me. It was the whole system. The ports, customs, health ministry, even parliament. They called it trade diplomacy, said we needed Europe, that we had no leverage. And the money? Silence. I saw your account statements, your villa in Morocco, your daughter's education at the Sorbonne, your wife's medical treatments in Geneva, all paid for with death certificates." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. "Did you know what was in those containers?" Traoré pressed. Udeagro's voice was barely audible. "We all knew." The investigation that followed was swift and merciless. Traoré established a National Truth and Reconciliation Commission with a mandate to examine 30 years of environmental agreements and trace every dollar that had changed hands in the process. The commission's work revealed a conspiracy that reached into every level of government and extended across multiple administrations. Former presidents had posed for photos with EU officials while signing agreements that would poison their own people. Ministers had collected briefcases full of cash while their constituents developed respiratory diseases from tire smoke. Port officials had been paid to stamp documents without inspecting cargo that contained everything from medical waste to industrial chemicals. The financial trail was equally damning. Commission investigators, working with international banking experts, traced over 47 million euros in payments to Burkinabe officials over 2 decades. The money had funded luxury lifestyles, foreign real estate purchases, and Swiss bank accounts, while rural communities struggled with contaminated water and dying livestock. State television began airing nightly segments called "The Price of Rubber," which detailed specific contracts and named individual officials who had participated in the conspiracy. Each episode combined documentary evidence with testimony from affected communities, creating a devastating portrait of systemic betrayal. The international impact was immediate. European media outlets, initially skeptical of Traoré's claims, began investigating their own government's roles in the waste export system. Activists in France and Germany demanded accountability from companies that had profited from the dumping scheme. The European Parliament announced hearings on waste export policies. But it was the domestic reaction that mattered most. Citizens who had lived for decades under a cloud of toxic smoke and contaminated water finally understood the scope of their betrayal. Town halls filled with angry residents demanding answers. Village councils passed resolutions condemning former officials. Teachers incorporated the commission's findings into history lessons, ensuring that future generations would understand the price of trading sovereignty for temporary financial gain. When the environmental test results finally arrived, they came in thick folders stamped with the seal of the National Environmental Laboratory and co-signed by independent scientists from 3 universities. Dr. Solange Bationa, the country's leading soil scientist, had spent 6 months conducting the most comprehensive environmental assessment in Burkina Faso's history. The cabinet meeting where she presented her findings was unlike any in the country's recent memory. Ministers sat in complete silence as Dr. Bationa spread color-coded maps across the conference table, each hue representing a different level of contamination. "We tested 127 known dumping sites across the country," she began, her voice clinical but carrying an undertone of barely controlled emotion. "The results range from concerning to catastrophic." She pointed to a large red zone near the border with Ghana. "This area will require decades of remediation. Lead concentrations are 12 times the international safety limit. Cadmium levels are 7 times higher than acceptable standards. The topsoil is essentially dead. Nothing will grow there without massive intervention." Murmurs of distress rippled through the room. These weren't just statistics. They were describing villages where people lived, farmed, and raised children. Dr. Bationa moved to the next map, this one showing more hopeful yellow and green zones. "The northern plateau shows better results. Rubber was dumped there, but not burned, so much of the soil can be restored through composting and phytoremediation. We project full agricultural recovery within 5 years. But it was the Central Valley that told the most complex story. Mixed results, Dr. Bationo continued. Some areas are surprisingly resilient, but others— she paused, consulting her notes— others contain residual mercury, arsenic, and battery acid. We even found European-manufactured medical syringes buried 3 feet underground. The maps were projected on the wall for all to see. Green zones indicated areas suitable for immediate agricultural restoration. Yellow zones required treatment but were salvageable. Red zones demanded intensive remediation and would be unsuitable for farming for decades. The red zones outnumbered the green zones. That evening, TRAORÉ stood before the nation with no teleprompter, no speechwriter's elegant phrases, just raw truth delivered with the moral authority of someone who had refused to look away from his country's wounds. "This," he said, holding up Dr. Bationo's report, "is what betrayal looks like in numbers." He placed the document on the podium and looked directly into the camera. "For decades, they dumped poison in our land and called it partnership. They fed us waste and called it cooperation. They buried rubber, plastic, batteries, and blood-soaked medical syringes in the earth where our children should be planting their future." The broadcast included maps, soil samples, and data charts that scrolled across the screen as TRAORÉ spoke. But it was his next words that transformed national shame into national purpose. "These are our scars, but we do not show them for pity. We show them for reckoning. This is our damage report, but we're not victims seeking sympathy. We're builders reclaiming our dignity." The soil recovery initiative that he announced that night would become one of the most ambitious environmental restoration projects in African history. Every red zone would receive immediate attention. Yellow zones would be treated through community-led programs. Green zones would become demonstration sites for sustainable agriculture. But this wouldn't be another aid-dependent project managed by foreign experts. This would be a Burkinabe solution implemented by Burkinabe hands. At the University of Ouagadougou, Dr. Bationo established mobile soil testing laboratories staffed by students and community volunteers. These weren't sophisticated research facilities, but simple, practical operations that could travel to remote villages and provide immediate results to farmers worried about their land. The laboratories used basic chemistry to test soil pH, heavy metal concentrations, and organic matter content. Students learned to identify contamination indicators using strips of cabbage juice, lemon water, and other materials available in any village market. 13-year-old Salif, the orphaned boy who had joined the Youth Environmental Brigade, became one of the most skilled soil testers in the program. He could identify lead contamination by color changes in plant extracts and estimate mercury levels by observing how earthworms responded to soil samples. "The earth tells you everything," he explained to a group of visiting journalists, holding up a test tube filled with dark water. "This sample came from a red zone near Bobo Dioulasso. See how the water stays black even after filtering? That means heavy metals. But this one," he held up a second tube of clear water, "came from a field where they've been composting for 6 months. The soil is healing itself." The call went out across radio stations, social media, and village notice boards. Your country needs your hands. No age requirements, no educational prerequisites, no applications or entrance exams. Just a simple invitation for young people to join something larger than themselves. They came from everywhere, from the university dormitories of Ouagadougou and the rural compounds of the northern provinces, from the mining towns of the southwest and the farming villages along the rivers. Barefoot children who had never seen a city, teenage mothers supporting families, high school dropouts with dreams bigger than their circumstances, engineering students looking for practical applications of their theoretical knowledge. The Youth Environmental Brigade began with 500 volunteers. Within 3 months, it had grown to over 15,000 young people organized into teams across every province in the country. Their training camps were unlike anything Burkina Faso had ever seen. No military drills or ideological indoctrination, just practical education delivered by farmers, engineers, and environmental scientists who understood that revolution begins with knowledge. Recruits learned soil biology from university professors who explained how earthworms could process contaminated earth and transform it into fertile growing medium. They studied rubber chemistry from mechanics who taught them to identify which tires could be safely repurposed and which required special disposal. They practiced water purification techniques using locally available materials like sand, charcoal, and banana peels. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to see waste as potential. What European companies had dumped as garbage, the brigade learned to view as raw materials for construction, agriculture, and community development. Salif had lived in the rusted shell of an abandoned bus since his parents died in a cholera outbreak 3 years earlier. At 13, he was responsible for his 8-year-old sister Aminata, scavenging metal and plastic to sell for food money and sleeping under cardboard when the rains came. When he heard about the youth brigade on a battery-powered radio at the market, he walked 40 kilometers to the nearest recruitment center, carrying his sister on his back and all their possessions in a single plastic bag. The recruitment officer, a young woman named Lieutenant Kaba, looked at this small boy with his enormous responsibilities and saw not a problem but a solution. "What do you know about soil?" she asked. "I know it's sick," she replied. "The vegetables won't grow where they used to. The water tastes like metal. My grandmother said the earth has a fever. Would you like to learn how to make it healthy again?" Salif nodded solemnly. "If I can fix the earth, maybe I can fix everything else too." Within 6 months, Salif had become one of the brigade's most effective teachers. He could explain complex environmental concepts in simple terms that other children understood. He developed games that helped village kids remember soil testing procedures. He designed songs that made composting techniques easy to memorize. But his greatest talent was his ability to help other young people see past their circumstances to their potential. When new recruits arrived discouraged by poverty or educational gaps, Salif would tell them, "I lived in a bus and ate garbage for 3 years. Now I'm teaching university students how to heal poisoned ground. Your past doesn't choose your future." At the Ouagadougou Institute of Science and Technology, President Traoré's unannounced visit on a dusty Wednesday morning would become the stuff of legend. Students in blue coveralls were scattered across workshop tables covered with tires, water tanks, pipes, and half-assembled contraptions that looked like the offspring of engineering textbooks and desperation. Traoré walked among the workstations without ceremony, his sleeves rolled up, asking questions and listening to explanations with the intensity of someone who understood that innovation often emerges from constraint rather than abundance. At one table, a shy young man with thick glasses was assembling what looked like a tire filled with tubes and valves. When Traoré asked about his project, the student's nervousness melted away as he began explaining his passion. "It's a gravity-fed drip irrigation system," the student said, his hands moving confidently over the components. "The tire acts as a water reservoir. These pipes distribute water slowly and evenly to plants. The system uses no electricity, requires minimal maintenance, and can irrigate half an acre using only recycled rainwater. TRAORÉ studied the system carefully. How much does it cost to build? Less than $5 per unit. Everything can be made from materials found in any village. Does it work? The student hesitated. It's still in testing, but preliminary results suggest it could triple crop yields during dry seasons. TRAORÉ turned to his aide. Fund this, not just for testing, for implementation. The student's jaw dropped as applause erupted from his classmates. But TRAORÉ wasn't finished. He moved to another table where 3 young women were building vertical farming towers from stacked tires. Their design allowed for multiple crops to be grown in a small space, with each level providing optimal conditions for different plants. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. One of the students, her fingers stained with soil, looked up confidently. "My grandmother grows vegetables in old tires behind our house. I just added mathematics to her wisdom." "You've just engineered a food revolution," TRAORÉ told her. The impact of that visit extended far beyond the university. Within weeks, the irrigation systems were being tested in villages across the drought-prone northern provinces. The vertical farming towers became standard equipment for the youth brigade. Most importantly, young people across the country suddenly understood that their ideas mattered, that innovation could emerge from anywhere, and that solving local problems could create global solutions. The Rebuild from Rubber program launched with a simple premise. If Europe could dump 40 years' worth of trash on Burkina Faso, then Burkina Faso could spend 40 years transforming that trash into something beautiful, useful, and dignifying. Collection centers in every district became workshops, laboratories, and art studios. Youth brigade members worked alongside experienced craftspeople, learning to cut, shape, and mold rubber into products their grandparents could never have imagined. The competition aspect captured national imagination. Communities competed to design the most innovative use for discarded tires. The winner would receive government funding and national recognition, but more importantly, they would prove that creativity could triumph over contamination. In Banfara, a women's cooperative turned old tires into playground equipment for the local school. Children who had once played among piles of toxic waste now enjoyed swings, slides, and climbing structures made from the same materials that had threatened their health. In Zinyaré, a group of disabled veterans used their military engineering skills to create accessibility ramps and stair treads from processed rubber. For the first time, wheelchair users could enter public buildings with dignity rather than struggle. At the University of Bobo-Dioulasso, students built a pedestrian bridge over a seasonal flood zone using layered tires fused with recycled metal. The bridge was not only functional but beautiful, with decorative patterns that told the story of transformation through traditional Mosi artistic symbols. But it was an elderly carpenter in the village of Tenodogo who captured the nation's heart and imagination. Baba Siaka was 73 years old, his hands gnarled with arthritis, his carpenter's strength diminished by age. When his grandson told him about the rubber recycling competition, neighbors thought the old man was losing his mind. For weeks, Baba Siaka worked alone in his compound, slowly cutting, heating, and shaping discarded tires with the patience that only comes from a lifetime of craftsmanship. His neighbors whispered concerns about his health, his mental state, his stubborn refusal to accept that his working days were behind him. But when officials arrived to judge his entry, they found a courtyard transformed into an outdoor furniture showroom that would have impressed customers in Paris or New York. Chairs with elegant curved backs made from precision-cut tire treads. A dining table with a glass top supported by a base of interwoven rubber rings. A rocking chair that moved with the gentle rhythm of traditional West African music. When the judges asked why he had chosen to make furniture, Baba Siaka's answer became one of the most quoted statements of the Transformation era. Because our leaders once sat on chairs imported from the countries that dumped on us. Now we sit on what they left behind, and we sit proud. His furniture was photographed for international magazines. One chair was placed in the presidential palace garden. Another was sent to the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. But the most meaningful recognition came from his 8-year-old granddaughter, who told a television reporter, "My grandfather showed me that trash has memory, and hands can heal it." In the small town of Tenodogo, what began as a simple exhibition of recycled rubber products evolved into something unprecedented. A museum dedicated not to celebrating the past, but to documenting transformation. The centerpiece was a throne built by Baba Siaka and a team of youth volunteers. 7 tires, one from each region of Burkina Faso, had been cut, sanded, shaped, and assembled into a seat that commanded attention without demanding submission. The armrests were made from melted and molded rubber mixed with crushed glass, creating a surface that shimmered under gallery lights like stars reflected in dark water. But this wasn't a throne for rulers. It was a chair for storytellers. Every afternoon, the museum hosted l'heure du sol, the soil hour, where children took turns sitting on the throne and sharing stories. Some told traditional folk tales about rubber dragons and sunflower armies. Others recounted real stories from their villages, grandmothers who planted gardens in tire beds, boys who built bridges from scrap metal, teachers who transformed poisoned ground into classroom gardens. Above the throne, a wooden plaque carried a simple inscription in Mouret, French, and English. "We were once walked on, now we stand." The museum also displayed children's artwork, crayon drawings of tire gardens, rubber bridges, and smiling faces that filled the walls with color and hope. One drawing showed a tire floating in space like a planet wrapped in green vines. The 7-year-old artist had titled it simply, "Home." As news of Burkina Faso's transformation spread, international delegations began arriving to witness what media outlets were calling the miracle of West Africa. Environmental scientists came to study soil remediation techniques. Urban planners wanted to understand how tire recycling could address waste management challenges. Artists and designers sought inspiration from the aesthetic innovations emerging from necessity. But not all international attention was positive. European waste management companies, suddenly faced with the loss of their cheapest disposal option, began lobbying their governments to reverse Burkina Faso's policies. A leaked memo from a Brussels-based trade association referred to the transformation as a dangerous precedent that threatens the entire African waste absorption market. Another document, obtained by investigative journalists, revealed a coordinated campaign to demonstrate the economic consequences of environmental extremism. The pressure took various forms. International development loans were mysteriously delayed. Medical equipment shipments were held up at customs in neighboring countries. NGO funding was quietly redirected to more cooperative governments. But perhaps the most insidious attack came in the form of a fake development project. The documents arrived in an unmarked envelope at the presidential palace, accompanied by a formal proposal from Belvert Industries, a French conglomerate with offices across West Africa. The proposal was beautifully produced, glossy pages filled with architectural renderings, environmental impact assessments, and financial projections that promised to transform Burkina Faso's waste problem into an economic opportunity. The project was seductive in its apparent perfection. A €28 million investment in a state-of-the-art tire recycling facility that would process waste into construction materials and export-ready fuel. The environmental review carried signatures from European scientists. The French ambassador had signed a joint letter of cooperation. The timeline was realistic, the financial projections conservative, the environmental benefits undeniable. But something felt wrong. TRAORÉ brought the proposal to his anti-corruption task force, a team of investigators who had developed an instinct for detecting deception beneath layers of bureaucratic legitimacy. Within 48 hours, they had uncovered the truth behind the beautiful lies. There was no equipment, no engineering team, no actual investment. The proposed facility was nothing but an empty lot leased under a fake construction company. The plan was to use the site as a legal front to resume waste imports under the guise of processing, while quietly disposing of the materials through the same old methods of burning and burial. Worse, the timeline revealed that the scheme had been developed 6 months before Traoré's waste ban, suggesting that former officials had not only known about the deception, but had helped design it. At the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, heads of state gathered in the familiar ritual of diplomatic courtesy and ceremonial speeches. But when Ibrahim Traoré took the podium, he carried only a small black folder that would shatter the decorum of continental politics. This, he said, holding up an architectural rendering of the fake recycling plant, is a lie. The hall fell silent as he explained how European companies had attempted to circumvent his environmental protections through elaborate deception. He passed out copies of the leaked documents to every delegation, watching as presidents and prime ministers read evidence of how their own sovereignty could be undermined through false partnership. "I do not bring this to shame any particular country," Traoré continued, his voice carrying across the hushed auditorium. "I bring this to warn all of us. What was attempted in Burkina Faso is not unique. It is a pattern. They do not build in darkness, they build in plain sight with our signatures, our silence, our cooperation." The impact was immediate. Several leaders requested copies of Burkina Faso's environmental audit procedures. Kenya announced a review of all EU-funded recycling projects. Ghana's parliament scheduled hearings on foreign waste management contracts. But the most significant response came from ordinary citizens across the continent, who suddenly understood that environmental protection and economic sovereignty were inseparable struggles. The transformation of Burkina Faso had been led by adults, presidents and ministers, scientists and engineers, but it was sustained by children who understood that their future depended on the choices being made in the present. In village schools across the country, teachers began incorporating environmental restoration into every subject. Mathematics lessons involved calculating compost ratios and irrigation volumes. Science classes studied soil chemistry and plant biology. Art projects focused on designing beautiful objects from waste materials. Even literature classes analyzed the stories emerging from the transformation, understanding that they were living through history worth documenting. But the children didn't just study the change, they drove it forward with the fearless creativity that adults often abandon in favor of cautious pragmatism. In the village of Bulsa, 10-year-old Mariam Sawadogo convinced her classmates to convert their school's tire dump into a food forest. Working with youth brigade volunteers, they planted fruit trees inside large tire rings, created herb gardens in smaller ones, and built a composting system that turned kitchen scraps into fertilizer. Within a year, the school was producing enough food to supplement the lunch program while teaching students practical skills in agriculture and nutrition. More importantly, the children had learned that they didn't need to wait for adult permission to solve problems they could see and understand. The photograph that would define the transformation era wasn't staged or planned. It was captured by a local journalist on a quiet morning in the village of Yalgo, where an unlikely miracle had taken root in soil that had been poisoned for decades. President TRAORÉ had arrived unannounced, wearing dusty boots and a work shirt, looking more like a farmer than a head of state. He stood at the edge of a vast green field where onions sprouted from rows of recycled pyre planters, his expression thoughtful, almost sorrowful, as if processing the weight of what had been lost and what had been recovered. The journalist, recognizing the historic significance of the moment, raised her camera and captured a single frame, Traoré standing among the tire gardens, one hand on his hip, the other brushing against a flowering plant, surrounded by the green abundance that had grown from black waste. She posted the image online with a simple caption: "He didn't recycle rubber, he recycled betrayal." Within hours, the image had been shared millions of times across social media platforms. It appeared on classroom walls and in WhatsApp groups. International news outlets used it to illustrate stories about African innovation. Artists created variations and tributes. Musicians wrote songs inspired by the message. But the most powerful responses came from children who saw in the image a possibility they had never imagined, that waste could become wonder, that betrayal could become the seed of something beautiful, and that their own small hands could help heal wounds that seemed too deep for healing. As the image circulated globally, an unexpected response emerged from European classrooms, where teachers were grappling with how to discuss their country's roles in Africa's environmental crisis. In Lyon, France, a class of 14-year-olds watched footage of the tire transformation and wrote letters to children in Burkina Faso. The letters were hesitant, searching, filled with the kind of honesty that adults often struggle to achieve. "We were taught France was good, but good people don't bury others in their trash. I don't know how to undo what we did, but I will plant something like you. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but if you teach us how you healed, maybe we can do it too. My grandfather worked for a company that sent tires to Africa. He says he didn't know they were poisonous, but I think maybe he didn't want to know. I'm sorry for what we did to your land." 70 such letters were mailed to schools in Burkina Faso, translated by volunteers and published in local newspapers. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Children who had spent years breathing toxic smoke suddenly had pen pals who wanted to learn from their experience rather than lecture them about development. One Burkina-based student, a member of the youth brigade named Fatinata, wrote back to her French correspondent, "You don't need to be sorry forever, but you do need to remember, and you need to make sure it never happens again." The trial of the three former ministers, Isaka Kabore, Jules Sanu, and Theodore Yamiogo, became a national reckoning that transcended simple legal proceedings. The courthouse was packed each day with families whose lives had been devastated by the policies these men had implemented. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed millions in payments from European waste companies. Audio recordings captured casual conversations about bribes and environmental destruction. Shipping manifests revealed the gap between what was promised, development assistance, and what was delivered, toxic waste. But the most devastating evidence came from the contaminated communities themselves. Farmers testified about soil that would no longer support crops. Mothers described children born with respiratory problems in areas near tire dumps. Village elders recalled streams that had run clear for generations before turning black with chemical runoff. The defense strategy was predictable. The ministers claimed they had followed orders, acted within legal frameworks, and made decisions based on the best available information. They portrayed themselves as patriots who had made difficult choices in difficult times, bureaucrats caught between competing pressures and inadequate resources. But that defense crumbled when the prosecution played an audio recording from a 2014 ministerial meeting. The voices of all three defendants could be heard discussing how to maximize profits from waste imports while minimizing public scrutiny. "The EU is offering another €5 million if we take the next shipment under the education code," Kabore's voice was crystal clear. "It'll be the same as before. Broken electronics labeled for schools," Sanu replied with audible amusement. "As long as the West pays, let them dump. They'll never check," Yamiogo added, followed by laughter from the room. The silence in the courtroom after that recording was absolute. Even the defendant seemed stunned by the casual cruelty of their own words. The judge's verdict was swift and uncompromising. All three defendants were found guilty of environmental sabotage, financial misconduct, and betrayal of public trust. But rather than simply imposing prison sentences, she ordered a more creative form of justice: the complete seizure of their assets to fund soil rehabilitation, combined with 5 years of mandatory community service in the very villages they had helped poison. The real victory, however, wasn't the convictions, but the national conversation they prompted. For the first time in Burkina Faso's post-independence history, citizens could see that accountability was possible, that corruption had consequences, and that their government was capable of choosing their interests over foreign pressure. The seized assets funded new environmental monitoring systems, expanded the Youth Brigade program, and provided scholarships for students studying environmental science and sustainable development. 5 years after that first viral video of tire dumps stretching to the horizon, the landscape of Burkina Faso had been fundamentally transformed. Where mountains of toxic waste once poisoned the air, productive gardens now fed communities and demonstrated that environmental restoration could be both practical and profitable. The statistics were remarkable. Over 3 million tires recycled into useful products, 15,000 hectares of contaminated land restored to agricultural productivity, 50,000 young people trained in environmental restoration techniques, and a 40% reduction in respiratory diseases in formerly contaminated areas. But the numbers couldn't capture the deeper transformation, the sense of dignity reclaimed, the confidence that came from solving problems with local resources and indigenous innovation, the understanding that waste was often just potential waiting for the right vision and the right hands. In what was once called the pit, the massive tire dump that had symbolized Burkina Faso's degradation, children now played among gardens that bloomed with vegetables, flowers, and fruit trees. The air smelled of grilled corn and hibiscus tea instead of burning rubber and chemical decay. At the center of this transformed space stood the memorial that had become a pilgrimage site for visitors from across Africa and beyond. A circular plaza made from recycled tire bricks surrounded a simple stone plaque with words that had become the unofficial motto of the transformation. "They buried us in waste, but forgot we were seeds." Every Saturday, families gathered in the plaza for storytelling sessions where children shared memories, dreams, and lessons learned from their community's journey. The stories were collected in a book published annually by the Ministry of Culture, creating a living archive of transformation told in the voices of those who had lived it. On a quiet Tuesday morning, exactly 5 years after his first visit to the tire dumps, President TRAORÉ returned to Yalgo village. This time, he came not as a leader making pronouncements, but as a student seeking to understand what his policies had made possible. The field where he had once stood surrounded by toxic waste was now a productive farm managed by a cooperative of women who had lost family members to pollution-related illnesses. Neat rows of vegetables grew from tire planters that had been painted with traditional patterns and filled with rich compost created from organic waste. Amina Odrago, the widow who had started the village cleanup effort, was now the cooperative's president and a national symbol of grassroots environmental action. She walked TRAORÉ through the fields, explaining how they had developed drought-resistant planting techniques and created a seed bank that preserved traditional varieties alongside new crops adapted to changing climate conditions. "This is what sovereignty looks like," she told him, gesturing toward rows of onions, tomatoes, and leafy greens that fed both the village and the regional market. Not just political independence, but the ability to feed ourselves from our own soil with our own hands. As they walked, children from the village school joined them, eager to show off their own tire gardens and explain the environmental science they had learned through hands-on experimentation. One 10-year-old boy, grandson of a woman who had died from lung disease linked to tire smoke, proudly presented TRAORÉ with a bouquet of flowers grown in a repurposed tire that his grandmother had once cursed as a symbol of foreign indifference. She would be proud, TRAORÉ said, accepting the flowers with tears in his eyes. The transformation of Burkina Faso had ripple effects that extended far beyond its borders. Other African nations began implementing their own versions of waste import bans and environmental restoration programs. The African Union established new guidelines for waste management agreements with foreign partners. University programs in environmental restoration and waste recycling were launched in a dozen countries. But perhaps the most significant impact was psychological. A generation of young Africans had watched Burkina Faso refuse to accept environmental colonialism, had seen what was possible when dignity mattered more than development aid, had learned that innovation could emerge from constraint and beauty could grow from waste. International corporations found it increasingly difficult to justify waste export schemes as development assistance. European governments faced growing pressure from their own citizens to address environmental injustice. NGOs working in Africa had to confront uncomfortable questions about the sustainability and equity of their programs. 10 years after the first viral video of tire dumps, Burkina Faso had become something unprecedented, a nation that had transformed its greatest shame into its greatest source of pride. The country that had once been Europe's dumping ground was now exporting environmental technologies, sustainable development models, and hope. The Youth Environmental Brigade had evolved into a permanent institution, with graduates working across Africa and beyond to share the techniques and philosophy that had made transformation possible. Universities from around the world sent students to study in Burkina Faso's environmental restoration programs. The country that had once imported other people's waste was now exporting its own innovations. But the most important export was less tangible: the understanding that dignity could not be donated, that sustainability required sovereignty, and that the most powerful transformations often emerged from the deepest wounds. In schools across Burkina Faso, children learned environmental science through the story of their own national transformation. They studied the chemistry of soil restoration in gardens built on former dump sites. They learned mathematics by calculating the water efficiency of tire-based irrigation systems. They practiced literacy by writing letters to pen pals in countries that were beginning their own environmental restoration journeys. Most importantly, they learned that they lived in a country that had refused to accept someone else's trash as their destiny, that had chosen dignity over dependency, that had proven that waste was often just beauty waiting for the right vision. One of these children, a 12-year-old girl named Rasmane, daughter of Amina Ouedraogo, granddaughter of soil poisoned by foreign waste, stood each morning in her family's tire garden and watered vegetables that would feed her community. She had never known a Burkina Faso that accepted toxic waste as the price of development aid. For her, the tire gardens were not symbols of transformation, but simply the way things were supposed to be. When visitors asked her about the significance of what her country had accomplished, she often responded with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children possess. They gave us garbage because they thought we were garbage, but we're not garbage, we're gardeners. The story of Burkina Faso's transformation from dumping ground to garden nation offers lessons that extend far beyond environmental policy. It demonstrates that sovereignty is not just political, but psychological. The ability to refuse definitions imposed by others, to see potential where others see problems, to choose dignity over dependency. It shows that innovation often emerges from constraint, that communities closest to problems are often best positioned to develop solutions, and that young people can be powerful agents of change when given tools, training, and trust. Most importantly, it proves that transformation is possible even under the most challenging circumstances, that beauty can grow from the deepest wounds, and that no people, no matter how marginalized or exploited, are condemned to accept someone else's vision of their destiny. The children of Burkina Faso water their tire gardens each morning with the understanding that they are tending not just vegetables, but possibilities. Not just plants, but proof that dignity can bloom anywhere, that justice can grow from any soil, and that the future belongs to those brave enough to plant it with their own hands. In the words carved into the memorial stone where toxic waste dumps once poisoned the earth, "They buried us in waste, but forgot we were seeds. The seeds remember. The seeds endure. The seeds transform everything they touch. And the harvest continues."